Tēnā koutou katoa. Te whare e tu nei, te whenua i te koto nei, tēnā korua. He mihi nui ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohi. Waitaha ka te Mamoe kai tahu. Ki na mauna whakahi, ki na wai tiri nei, ki na rangatira huhua, tēnei te mihi, tēnei te mihi. Ki na mate o te wā, rātou kua, whetū rangatia, haere, haere, moi mai rā. Rātou ki a rātou, tātou ki a tātou. E te upoko o tu runaka o tākau, Edward, nā mihi nui ki a koe. E te kai kōrero o tēnei pō, Dr. Megan Pōtiki, tēnā koe. He mihi hoki ki tō whānau, i tuki, tēnā koe. I ngā rangatira, i ngā homahi, i ngā tauera, i ngā tangata katoa, tēnā koutou. E mihi ana ki te kaupapa o te pō, ko tēnei kauhau hei whakamauma haratanga o Michael King. Me ana tini mahi mō te aki me te whakatairanga o ngā hituri o tēnei whenua. Ahakoa he mihi poto tēnei, he mihi aroha. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So, good evening everyone. My name's Tony Ballantyne and I'm very lucky to be a Professor of History here at the university and have the great honour of just saying a few words in the way of a mihi to get us underway this evening. I'm going to pass over to Mark Seymour, Professor Mark Seymour, our Head of Program, who's going to talk a little bit about the significance in the history of the Michael King lecture. So Mark.
Tēnā koe Tony I tō kōrero. Ko Mark Seymour tōku ingoa, ko te tumuaki aho o te hōtaka kōrero o nehe. No ingarangi o ku tīpuna, engari kei o te pote tōku kāinga I nāia nei. No mai, haere mai, ki te koho nei. Good evening, I'm Mark Seymour, Head of the History Programme, and a very warm welcome to this year's Michael King Lecture to be delivered by Dr. Megan Pōtiki. It was originally scheduled for last October, but we had to cancel on the very day due to flooding, so and this morning I thought, oh no, not again. So thank you for coming back. My colleague Angela Wanhala will introduce our speaker, but beforehand I'd just like to give some brief background information on Michael King himself and the annual lecture in his name. I, as a responsible head of programme, should also mention that should anything threaten our safety in this lecture theatre, the main exits are these two at the front, but your nearest exit may be behind you. I won't ask you to count the rows, but those inauspicious steps at the back do lead directly to the outside world. Michael King was a much-loved historian and by all accounts a wonderful man. I didn't know him personally, but some of my colleagues did, and he forged strong links with Dunedin when he was a Burns Fellow here in the late 1990s. I'd just started my job here in February 2004, and I still remember the sense of shock and grief when Michael King, along with his wife Maria, was killed at the age of 58 in a car accident on the 30th of March 2004. Later that year, under the headship of Barbara Brooks, we established an annual lecture in Michael King's name. Tonight's will be the 19th lecture. COVID accounts for the missing 2, and Megan takes her place in an illustrious line of speakers. Michael was notably committed to Māori history and to Aotearoa New Zealand. He engaged deeply with local communities to write biographies of both Te Puia Herangi and Whina Cooper, for example. His output of books was prodigious, and his engaging style led to Reader's Choice Awards in 2001 and 2004, the year of his death. Michael's interest in photography led to work with photographer Marty Friedlander on his book on Moko, leading to an invaluable set of images. And it was fitting that Marty Friedlander herself gave the inaugural Michael King lecture in late 2004, titled Photography as History. Michael's loss is still felt, but we remember him each year with this lecture. And with that, I'll now ask Angela to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Mark, and good evening, everyone who are here in person and also online. So I get the wonderful opportunity, and great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. So I think we all know Megan pretty well in this room, and I think in the normal cases we would go through a very long list of all your scholarly achievements and exceptional abilities and wonderful things that you've done, but I'm not going to do that for you, Megan, you'll be happy to know, because I think while those are really important things about what Megan does, I think what's more significant about Megan is, in terms of her contribution to kaitahu Māori and New Zealand scholarship, is that it's defined by her whānau, by Otako, and her work with Māori language manuscripts, and these have really shaped her approach to interpreting the past, and I think they really are kind of beautifully, the work she does is beautifully crafted along those lines. So many of you will know that Megan wrote her PhD on Māori language death, focusing on her haukainga, Otako, which she completed I think a couple of years ago now, and defended it on the marae at Otako as well. So being someone who was raised in her village makes Megan a distinctive voice in Māori history, a person who is strong in identity and language and comfortable with Māori language texts, and is someone who is focused not on kaitahu disconnection, but on kaitahu flourishing. And I think that's a really important part of Megan's role and her kind of public work that she does within Dunedin today. For Megan, therefore, doing Māori history, to quote her from Books of Mana, means writing in te reo, intertwining your whakapapa into your idiom and phrases. Through Māori manuscript material, Megan has explored Mamoe, dreams, to discuss the intersections of history, language and tikanga practices in the past and the present. She's worked closely with the writings of a very important ancestor and important political leader, H.K. Tairoa. And such materials, Megan has said, are really critical because they open up worlds, and in her words, they're like gold. You can't put a price on those manuscripts. They've helped us understand so much of who we are as kaitahu. In addition to te reo Māori and manuscripts, whānau, especially her parents, tēnā koe Edward, her children, and her late husband Tahu, have been an important catalyst for Megan's writing. And if you've read any of her wonderful mana wahine columns in the Otago Daily Times, you'll have encountered stories about her children, endless stories about her children. I'm sure they're quite embarrassed about it. And her PhD, as she has said, was for Tahu, who strongly encouraged her to undertake the project, discussed it with her, and the desire to honour him was the catalyst needed to help her complete it in some very difficult times. So those of you here in person and online will know Megan very well and probably aware that Megan is unflinchingly honest at times, but that is done in a way that is authentic and underpinned by a sense of generosity. And I'm sure that we'll get a taste of that honesty and generosity tonight, along with an insight into how whānau, language and kaitahu archives have informed Megan's approach to the past. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Megan Pōtiki to deliver the 2025 Michael King Memorial Lecture.
Oh, sorry, that's all right. Kia ora tātou. Thank you everyone. It's always a little bit awkward having my father in the audience because really he could probably deliver this lecture, but and afterwards he'll tell me off for getting a few dates wrong or something that wasn't quite right, but that's okay. He can fix up the mistakes later. And thank you. This is a cup filler for me. I'm doing another job at the Pōtiki, which is pretty grueling, and so I don't get to dip my toes back into this very often, and I really, I need it basically to sort of, it's wider filling and important. But truly, and I actually just truly believe that it's with, Tahu and Dad and everyone, like you said, Angela, everyone from Otako, this is actually I always just believe it's their work, and it might sound a bit weird, but even my PhD, I look at it and go, it's like I didn't write it, because it's the writing of many. So it's just pulled together. I just had to pull it together, and that's just, I guess that's being Māori, right? That's just kind of how we feel we are taking all of our tūpuna with us. So tonight I just want to talk to you about, well, it's a little bit about me, so I'm indulging myself, and a little bit about my son actually, who's not here. That's my youngest up there in the back. He's going to be so embarrassed by that. But my other son, who's away at a boarding school in the middle of the North Island, and that's another story. But he was named after the last prince of Ngāti Hawea and Ngāti Mamoe tribes. And Timoti Karetai is actually my son's name. He changed his name before he went to boarding school when he was 13 on the blessing of Dad after his dad died, my husband. He felt that he couldn't go into a Māori boys boarding school with a name that wasn't his by whakapapa. So he's changed his name to Timoti Huri Whenua Pōtiki Karetai. But in fact he was actually named after, and in here, a tupuna called Timoti Karetai, who actually fell off a cliff, which always makes me think, and Dad might know a little bit more about it, fell off a cliff maybe in the Kohu, I don't know, and he was talked about in the newspapers like they all were in a fatalistic way, that he was in fact the last prince of a dying breed. But interestingly, of course, my son's Timoti Karetai, so it wasn't a dying breed at all. And apparently, yeah, he was a good man, and yeah, I guess his legacy lives on through not just my son, but through many actually. There are quite a few Timoti Karetais. Some who are in the Milton Hotel, because obviously we have a history of deep scarred colonisation. That means that many of our children go in different directions, not always the directions that we want them to go in. Oops, what am I doing here? That would help if I actually knew what I was doing. So we talk, I suppose, about the idea that we were actually going to die out, and I'm sure all of you, many of you here know that story across the country. And this is a general map here of our migration. It's actually a counting down through the North Island there, some of our main battles as Ngai Tahu, descendants of Tahu Pōtiki, who were 13 generations after Tahu Pōtiki, who never stepped foot in the South Island, actually came down and battled their way through the North Island down to the South Island and married into many different iwi. Hawea, Rapu Wai, Mamoe were a migratory group as well. So we end up here at Ōtākau, and have a long history. Those earlier iwi, really we understand the Ngāi Tahu history and the Ngāti Mamoe history because they are the most recent, obviously. Kia ora, haramoe. They're the most recent histories, but also when you marry up Mamoe and Ngāi Tahu history, you get far more detail. The detail becomes a bit more obscure with older iwi, but we know that, for example, where we're from, Ōtākau, we know that that's one of the oldest villages in the country. We know that because of old place names that come from ancient iwi, and we have many examples of those. Ōtākau as a name, Kaikarai as a name. All of these old Māori names come from very old iwi, and so that sort of helps us connect the dots to who we are. So we're a mixture of a number of iwi. You can't extrapolate one from the other, so you're not just Ngāi Tahu, you're not just Waitaha, you're a mixture of all of those iwi. And so that's us. But in the colonisation period, which lasted for us for a really long time, that it actually we battled. So originally, of course, when Pākehā arrived, or Takata Pōrao, whoever you want to call Pākehā, arrived on our shores, many things were good for a while and then it shifted, but there were things that actually meant that we really were on the back foot by the end of World War II. we were struggling at the Kaik in my village. We had these sorts of issues, that really put nails in our coffins: religion, education, also the aspiration for us to want to participate fully in a European society. This was the financial capital of New Zealand, so the gold rush and all of those things, we actually want to fully participate in that society. Economic participation and economic deprivation, geographic location, obviously, which I just talked about. World War I and II really did us in. We lost a lot of our key men in that period, and then on top of that you have men also returning with PTSD into those communities where our women are raising our children and trying to keep things going. And land loss and critical mass, and there was just so many factors that we were struggling with over a really long period. This picture here actually is of the Allisons and Karitai whānau from Ōtākau. The man with the hat, his name is Rāniere Allison, who's my dad's grandfather, and he was from Taranaki, and he found gold, actually. Interesting story, that one. Māori Point and shot over river, so that was that's another story, another great story. But so there what you have though is his grandchildren. So you've got his daughter-in-law there, Oriwea, who's just sitting beside him. She's a karitai. She was a native speaker of Te Reo Māori. And then you've got grandchildren. Some of you may have known Aunt Mori Pickering. She died when she was 103. She's there in the white hat, sitting down below. And she died at 103. She did not speak Māori. So what happened in that era was they just stopped speaking to their children, and then it just got snuffed out, basically. My cousin Paulette often recounts the question she asked Aunt Mori when she was about 15 at Queen's High School. She was a kaumātua at Queen's High School. She used to say to her, do you know the Māori word for this? And she'd say, oh dear, I don't speak a word of Māori. And so Paulette was quite shocked, right? Because she had assumed that she spoke Māori. So that was really a big shift for us, losing Te Reo, and it gets snuffed out just like that, right? And it's so hard to bring back and normalise back into the community. So we are making assumptions too that they were native speakers, but we're pretty sure, we're certain about who were the last native speakers. Lockie actually questioned me in my PhD. He's my supervisor. He was brutal. He questioned me. He asked me a really good question. He said, have you ever wandered around the urupa at Ōtākau, the graveyard, and looked at the Māori language on the headstones? And it was just like a penny moment drop, because I was like, oh God, that will actually show when the language shifted. And I hadn't actually thought about doing that. So that did show a dramatic shift. So if you go into our village urupa, that's where you'll see a shift in language, and it was really helpful. Thank you. Okay, so because I want to take you on a more positive journey. How we know, or how I know some of the things I know. Manuscripts. So I've just kind of shared with you that we lost the language. Last native speaker Ngāi Tahu died in 2013, and he was from Temuka. And our last native speaker was 1969. Did I get that right, Dad? 67, we'll see. And he actually was raised in another area, but he was a native speaker from the Weasley whānau. So we had lost a lot of our native speakers, and in losing that we had this hiatus period where we kind of lost ourselves, probably a bit, lost cultural bastions. We were still burying our dead as Māori, but we were doing it in English, and we were holding on for dear life. Probably by the late 70s, things were rough as far as cultural capacity and language goes. So along comes a few younger ones after the claim, because the claim was the complete focus, the Ngāi Tahu claim for our people, like my husband, who went and learnt Te Reo Māori at Te Whare Wānanga o Raukawa in the 1980s. And there were others. I'm just going to use Tahu as an example. He was also really interested in manuscripts, because with the loss of the language, what we had in Ngāi Tahu was we had missionaries who were writing copious amounts of Ngāi Tahu knowledge, and a lot of them weren't tinkering with it. It was just verbatim from kaumātua. So we've got a lot of those manuscripts. You would have heard of Reverend Vollers and various other ones who learnt Te Reo Māori, amazing guys. Like, he come from North Germany, rocked up to, eventually to the Hokianga, went down, he lived on Ruapuki Island, an island lower than Bluff where the trees are like this. And it must just have been a bit crazy, but really, really intelligent, amazing missionaries. And they brought with them their stuff, right? But actually they also recorded a lot of Te Reo Māori. On top of that, we had our own speakers, and they had quickly learnt Te Reo Māori and English and how to write. But you've got to wonder, well, all of this stuff in these manuscripts, is it right? You know, is it just made up? Is it from another iwi? Was it corrupt? One of the things we do know is that there are informants of the 18 to 1900s that all kind of went to the same whare wānanga. So we had Māori universities. At the time that Pākehā arrived here, one of the things, they were quite amazed with Māori. They were like, wow, you know, Māori, I don't know what, I'm just making this up. Māori have got systems, and they've got chiefs, and they've got schools, and they've got villages, and this is kind of confusing because other Indigenous people aren't quite as set up as this. So that was quite unusual. And we had wānanga, and we know we had wānanga because we've written about the last whare wānanga in Kaiapoi, a very, very detailed account in Te Reo Māori about that wānanga. There's Wanaka, which is wānanga. So there was probably wānanga there, and we know there was wānanga in Moeraki, and there were more. In fact, you wonder whether we were going to wānanga in the North Island, because a lot of the information is really similar, right? So they're all sending these kids, and they were boys that would go into the wānanga. They would choose the sons of the chiefs, pretty much, to go into these wānanga. They would set them up, they would take them to a river, they would cleanse them, they would do karakia. This is all in the account of the Kaiapoi whare wānanga. They clean their ears out in the river and do karakia over them to get them completely ready for the wānanga. They'd take them into a house, and in the corner of the house was a ruahine, an old woman, and she was the mauri of the whare, the life force of the whare, and they would basically line them up or teach them in the dark, and they would rote learn whakapapa, stories, history, and they were all the same. So with all of these tupuna, and you may recognise some names, H.K. Taiaroa was the son of Te Mātinga Taiaroa, and it was his father who was possibly at a wānanga. So all of the information can be triangulated. And when Tahu was working on these manuscripts and not necessarily translating them, but code breaking them, because you can imagine what you have to do with an old manuscript, right? Like, you have got to understand the slant of the letter, the idiom, the phrase, the fact that he's talking about a horse and a cart and not a car, and that he's got whakapapa to this person, there's a battle there. It was code breaking. I think Tahu probably spent 30, 40 years of his life code breaking manuscripts. And then between himself and another Ngāi Tahu historian, Te Maire Tau, they come up with a triangulation model to make sure that actually, because we don't have native speakers, and because we're basically trying to revitalise our language and our tikanga, we need to make sure it's right. And in order to do that, we need to find the source of that place name that we think is about that in 3 places. And it needs to be from some of these tupuna, because we know that they're the real deal. So it's actually about authenticity, which is kind of quite a controversial word really in Te Ao Māori, I think, because what is authentic? But we would challenge that it means that we can find that information in a few places. Here's BTs and other Pākehā have been helpful in this space, but his work needs to be triangulated as well, because some of his interpretation of place names and etc. is not quite right, and that's okay. Because he probably heard it from one kaumātua and not another. And there were stories that at Otako we used to call him the man on the bike, and he'd rock up to Otako, and there was some slight animosity probably towards him wanting to glean information from us all the time. So you've got to work with all those tensions as well, right? So anyway, I won't go through all these guys, but they're a really interesting bunch. As I've mentioned, there are many missionaries and Pākehā collectors as well, and I know Tony's written about a lot of them. I mean, so's Lockie's and Angela. These are well known, not all missionaries, but collectors of information, and are valuable. Like if you triangulate their information with the original Te Reo Māori manuscripts, they're really valuable. I've just talked about just make sure I'm on track, because I go off track. I'm going to pass that one for now. So I guess this is my son, Te Moti, and he's at a Māori boys boarding school, and they're like, oh, that's his hand, that's his birthmark. I swear it's the South Island. Yeah, it's quite. Yeah, I reckon there's Stewart Island there. It's like, yeah. And so I just one of the things that I want to plant the seed now with you is that he's quite, well, you can see he's quite inquisitive, because he took off to the Chook House and did stuff like that from early on. But we would go into town, and he would make comment, and this is not exactly how he'd say it in his young boy talk, but he'd be like, who's that guy sitting up there in the octagon? Like, who is he? I'd be like, that's Robbie Burns. But I actually knew nothing about Robbie Burns either. So I had to go on a bit of a journey about Robbie Burns, and I realised, well, Robbie Burns hadn't even stepped foot in New Zealand, which was really surprising to me. And so he would just then be like, well, where's my tupuna in this city? Like, in his young language, where am I? Where are they? It was a constant. Every time we go in the octagon, it was a constant question. What is that guy doing sitting there in the middle of our city? No disrespect to Robbie Burns, by the way, really not. But, see where it's going. So that planted a bit of a seed in me, and it also put a fire in my belly about, and I think that's probably why I've ended up here, really. As well as his father, Tahu. It was like, well, we've probably got to do something about that. Yeah, so anyway, I just wanted to share that. The other thing that my boy did, he was probably about 8, he's 17 now. We would fly over occasionally Matamata, Saddle Hill, and discovered that obviously one of the peaks has been desecrated, really, or one of the humps of that taniwha. And so he set up he wanted to write to the mayor at the time, who was Dave Cull. Wrote to Dave Cull and said, look, Dave, no, he didn't say, look, Dave, but he's like, this is who I am. He wrote this story. This is who I am. And that he's actually so this is Matamata is a lizard. He's my kaitiaki, and I'm really concerned that this is what's happening to him. So all of these things started to embed in me and his dad, and to realise that actually this isn't right, and it's not great for my son to be feeling like he hasn't really got a really firm footing here because of all of these issues. So Matamata came through. He was looking for his so if he was a pet, his pet owner, and he pushed his way through the Taiari and out onto the peninsula, and you can see the shape of that lizard if you fly over Momona, over Taiari, and over the peninsula. You'll see that. So that's why that looks like that. And how do we know that story? We know the detail of that story because it's written in a few places and it's been handed down. The man in the middle at the back there is my great-grandfather, Dad's grandfather obviously. His name is Te Iwi Here Here Ellison. He was named after the jailing of the parihaka of the Taranaki people, because Te iwi here here means the jailing of the people. And that is his mother there, Ngāti Wera or Ngāti Wella, and there's whanaunga, various whanaunga there, and Paulette's kuia is there too, right? If you know Paulette Tamati Aleph. But he told that story about Matamata, and so he recounted that. It was published in a book, but we've also found it in a number of other places, so we know that it's legit. We also know that obviously those kōrero were handed down, through generations. And just on another sort of kōrero, which I want to link into the next tupuna that I'm going to talk about, who is H.K. Taiaroa. He wrote copious amounts of information. So H.K. Taiaroa was the first Southern MP in Parliament. He was born 1830s, we don't know when exactly, died in 1905, and he spent his entire life dedicated to basically the Ngaitahu claim. His name was Huri Whenua, and he was baptised Hori Kirei Taiaroa after Sir George Grey when he was probably about 7 or 8, we're not too sure. He was, I call him the godfather of the Ngaitahu claim, because he wrote copious amounts of information. He gathered it from Kaumātua, so it wasn't all his own information, and there's 36 boxes of his manuscripts sitting in the Canterbury Museum. So he dedicated his lifetime to recording everything: dreams, maps, place names, his feelings about a particular thing. He would delve quite deep into feelings, which is a little bit different to other kaitahu of the time. He actually recorded an amazing kōrero, which is like a 7-page diary extract on exorcising demons, which is patu taipo. Taipo is a demon, and patu means to hit or to kill. And it occurred with Ngāti, really. Ngāti, who's the one that's holding the patu in that way. She got sick with a mate Māori. She got sick with a Māori illness that couldn't be explained. And so they brought a tohunga to Ōtākau, and HK recorded the entire thing, and they basically took out all of the wāhi tapu that were on the peninsula, on both sides of the peninsula. There were tuahu, altars, where these wāhi tapu were, and they were placed there previously by old atua, by even as far back as Rākai Hautu, ancient tupuna. And so they did this process where they went across the harbour, and they followed in a line and followed instructions of this tohunga, picking up bits of rākau, of sticks and leaves, and quite, it seems quite odd to me, but they followed a particular tikanga. They ended up at this altar where they saw, HK Taiaroa actually says, and this isn't te reo, but this is my translation of it, believe me, I saw this with my own eyes, kahukura, a demigod, crouched on top of the tuahu. And the actual, and the tohunga told them to stand behind him, and he ran towards Kahukura, and Kahukura ran, a sort of crouching tiger, hidden dragon, that's kind of how I imagine it. They ran to each other, and then basically the tohunga was thrown 30 feet into the air, toru putu te teitei ki runga, and then he came back down and he died for 30 minutes. And then Kahukura was gone. But what it is to me is actually a clash of religions, right? So you've got the tohunga who was bringing Christianity with him. He was from Ngāti Raukawa. And then you've got old Māori religion, and it's clashing right at that point. And who won, of course, was Christianity, because all of those old Māori tuahu and that were taken out. And then you will be better and well, he said to Ngāti and others. And of course she lived into her 80s and had 12 children, so she did okay, but Christianity won the day. And so it's quite interesting, that's that colonisation piece. And my boys, Tahu took my boys across to Port Chalmers to try and find the tuahu, but it had been It's not there anymore. But yeah, we sort of raised our kids on these stories. Probably not a great thing. But then if you think about Hansel and Gretel, that's not a great thing either. So to be honest, it's pretty scary. So he was always like, what did Kaukura look like, you know? And so he had to describe and make up this kind of, this demi-taniwha crouched on this tuahu. And these atua so old, we don't actually really mihi to these atua anymore. And they come up now and again. I mean, Kari, you might be connected to those atua, but I feel quite disconnected because they're very old. And so we've even colonised ourselves, right? So we mihi to atua that are perhaps more connected to the North Island than our kaitohu ones. HK. So HK's cool, like the godfather of the claim. He was the dude, and I'm really biased. You know, I am. I'll admit it. I'm not directly descended from HK. I come off his niece Nani, but my kids actually come off HK. But he's done some. Just his life has done some really good things for us. Okay, he's written lots of te reo Māori, and on the back of his mahinga kailis, we were able to put, actually probably get that Ngāi Tahu claim across the line. So there's a lot of things he's actually done. But I mean, even as tangi, he was dead, but at his tangi, we've got these amazing photos. And someone talked about, I think you mentioned something about, someone mentioned about the lecturer, the person that talked about photographic history. That is so true. So we've got manuscripts, but we've also got photos. And we've got lots of newspapers. Just, Google newspaper, new pepper, and then whatever it is, the kaupapa, and it'll come up. And actually, at Aunt Maurie's tangi, my auntie, who was 103 when she died just actually as we took down our old wharekai, and really at that time, and we put up our new wharekai. So it was all very serendipitous. But Paulette and I, we were like, should we, obviously there's this thing called pare kawakawa, these leaves that we wear in our hair, made of, or hair, or we hold wherever. And we just hadn't seen pare kawakawa at Ōtākau for forever, or not in our lifetime. We knew Tainui definitely do it, and we've seen it up north, but we just hadn't done it for 100 years. Just one of those cultural bits that just drop out when the language drops out, right? And so I think Paulette rang a cousin, who also a friend of a friend who was Tainui, and said, like, how do we even make them? Like, what do we even make them with? And so, because we thought we should honour Aunt Māori with this, right? So we sort of found out some pieces, and we used a ngaio tree, various trees that we had at the marae, and we made these pare kawakawa, and they were pretty rustic, but they did the job. And it was interesting, it was quite confrontational to some of our aunties who thought that we were being a little bit North Island. But they didn't know, right? Because in the process of colonisation, we'd lost this section of what we did at tangi. So in HK's, his photos of his tangi, you've got these beautiful pare kawakawa, and they look Hawaiian. I mean, they're better than what we made. Ours were a fairly average job, but we've got quite good at them now. And so we reinstated this pare kawakawa, and beautifully, I'm going to take some credit for this actually. I've seen it across Ngāi Tahu marae a lot in the last few years, and I feel really proud because actually I started to Google pare kawakawa across Ngāi Tahu, and at Ruapoki Island there's a whole heap of men in an old newspaper wearing pare kawakawa, and there's kōrero at Moirake, and they're everywhere, and it's like just reinstating those cultural tikanga are really important, and we sort of feel like we're getting back to something good. But yeah, they do look quite amazing. So HK is still influencing us. And actually, I think you might be in there, Kari, somewhere. We buried some koiwi. Was it 2 years ago? 3 years ago? I can't remember, about 2 or 3 years ago. We prepared to bury a number of koiwi that came from the museum that back in our urupa, and we followed. It's a very long process. because the men had to practice and learn karakia, particular karakia. We did it just before dawn, and the wahine had roles as well, and you can just see there that we had our parikawakawa on. So it's just about reinstating some of those things that have been lost. It really was an amazing spiritual event, actually, and something I'd never been involved in before, and actually haven't since. But now that we've done it, we're prepared, and we could do it again in other places. And I'm getting to my point. God, this is long, isn't it? I'm getting to my point. And just, I guess, thinking about culture, right? This is actually, Magdalene Walscott, she died when she was 100. We've got these, I think it might be the cockle juice. I'm not too sure. We've got longevity. But Magdalene Walscott wrote that contrary to what one might expect, both marae buildings are entirely made of brick, concrete and cement, even to the so-called carvings. So the interesting thing about Ōtākau as well is we adapted and we became nimble, because we built this in the 1940s. It was made in the Art Deco period. It was built from moulds, and it's concrete. And so it's the most unusual marae probably in that regard in the country. But it's about pragmatism and maintaining culture despite colonisation, right? And that's the issue. Tahu said something interesting on a documentary about Māori architecture. I listened to it about a year ago, and it was sort of a revelation to me. He said, Ōtākau has been quite lucky because we've got this whare, and because we had to build a whare that looked Māori in order to get the funding at the time, it was an apirana ngata thing, it forced us to be more Māori. So it's not just a hall. So many halls around Ngāi Tahu that act as whare, and no disrespect to those halls, because we had one too previous to this, but this whare, because it looks incredibly Māori, he suggested that we were forced to be more Māori, and I think that just put us a little bit ahead. For not against any other hapu, but just that it just forced us to be, actually work with our tikanga, work with as much reo as we had, and try and be more Māori in this space. Yeah, I'm not going to go there. There's Robbie. You've heard me talk about Robbie. Special Robbie. Right. So I've been on a bit of a journey, probably a very selfish journey, but actually for the hapu and for Māori in Dunedin. And I've been writing quite a few cultural narratives under the noses of racists. No, just jokes. And sort of they're coming up in design and build in Dunedin. And it's not just me. It's Dad's written heaps, and there's all of us are involved. We have a panel. It's not just a Megan thing, and the narratives get checked, and so it's quite a big process. So, and we've been fully in this since about 2019, and you'll notice Dunedin changing a little bit as we go. And really, there are some things that I consider when I'm thinking about these narratives, and I'm thinking about reinstating our mana back into Dunedin, basically. It's getting it right with your own people. Learned a lesson there. 2019, when we were starting on this journey and thinking about names for buildings. Names are power, I've learnt. And so upsetting particular whānau because their whānau is not representative is a very real thing, right? And so it's something that you have to be really careful about. And I've learnt some hard lessons with my own whānau about that, important lessons. I think when we're thinking about how we reinstate our narrative and our kōrero and whakapapa back into the city and back into these places, it's taking the time to find and cross-reference history and whakapapa. Because I've published a couple of things and I've gone, oh God, I think I've got that particular thing wrong. It happens, right? And as soon as it's published, it's biblical. And so it's like, oh geez. So it's really trying to get those things, and we're on a journey, I get it. So 10 years down the track, it might be like, oh, that's actually the meaning because we've found it in a manuscript that we hadn't come across for a while, you know. So these things happen, but it's important to get it right. That's that triangulation piece. Ensuring its authenticity, triangulation piece again, because actually we've had some interesting kōrero in our midst and some of it just isn't right. And so it's about trying to get it right. I guess for some, there's a reluctance to do the mahi and dig into the written sources. So some of our people just kind of want the ticket, the can you write the narrative and give it to me kind of thing, and then I've got all the information. But actually, you know, doing the hard grafting is actually really important, I think. Reluctance to acknowledge the author. There's a bit of that goes on in Te Ao Māori. So although we're writing narratives and things like that, sometimes our people aren't keen to acknowledge the person that actually wrote it. For example, my husband had an interesting political career, and yeah, I would say he's missing from some of his work because there's a reluctance to actually acknowledge that he actually did that. And I'm biased, you know, I'm just going to say that, you know, the reason we have all these kaitahu whakatauki and kiwaha is because he was a code breaker and he was able to pull those out of manuscripts and interpret them. And so just in honour of him, it is important to acknowledge the author, right? Be honest with ourselves. What did we know? What was lost? And what don't we understand? You know, so actually be real with ourselves, because we don't like to do that. When we're writing narratives and talking about bringing whakapapa and history together, we don't like to be honest. And how much of our whakapapa and history are we willing to give over? That's a constant debate at our rūnaka. Constant debate. Like, why are we writing narratives for this mainstream school? Why are we giving that information to them if they're not going to treat it well, or they don't really want to understand it? So there's all of those, you know, those kind of these kind of things I carry with me as we go on this journey. And one of the being honest with ourselves, this is an example, is there's a punishment register from Ōtākau Native School in the Hocken Library. And often one of the kōrero that comes up, and actually it's got your father in there because he was obviously, I think he was a bit naughty that day. Don't know, anyway, he's in there, I think so. Yeah, George Allison, there you go, for, oh, I'm going to say cheating. That's Dad's dad. My boy's named after him. Don't cheat. Anyway, being honest with ourselves, one of the things that I found, because what I was looking for in my PhD was whether there was any evidence of being punished physically for speaking Māori. This book, there's none. But the thing is that we actually lost the language very early. And if you look at you know, there's a lot of kōrero from Dover Samuels and various ones up north that talk about being physically punished in the 1960s. So it was happening quite late. But, you know, we'd lost the language very early. So being honest with ourselves is actually, you know, I do hear some of our people say, well, my nanny was smacked for speaking Te Reo Māori, might be in our village. I would challenge that because there's not a lot of evidence of that. In some regards, we relinquished it under complete pressure because we're having to feed our whānau, we're having to just basically maintain being Māori in a simple way, still collecting our kai, but one of the things that we dropped out was language because it just wasn't, it was important to us, but we probably hadn't really thought it through, right? We just stopped speaking to our children. So that's one of the things that you just need to be honest about it. You don't have to be embarrassed by it. It's just we're different here, and the timing of colonisation was different. I do know that there was punishment in Temuka, definitely, because I interviewed a kaumātua from there, and there's evidence of punishment. But they had a native school, and they were speaking Māori quite late in that area, and the last native speaker of Kaitahu come from Temuka. Right. So, Dunedin, changing it. There's an image of Dunedin, an early one, And one of the things that is driving some of our, so we've got a group of us that are writing, and there's a panel, and we're getting involved in design in Dunedin. And one of the things, our other drivers, is place names, right? So what you've got is you've got layers of Dunedin now. You've got a whakapapa of Ōtepoti, Dunedin, and even a modern layer on top of that. So there's layers, and underneath all those colonised layers is actually, you know, old names. And we don't, and these are names that belong to, that's a map that my husband did actually on the right hand side, and it's got the old names of Dunedin. You'll see that there's Ngā Moana e Rua, which is like two waterways joined together. You wouldn't even see that now, that's laid, I mean, it's all been built over, so it looks nothing like this image. But part of the whole narrative drive and design and shift to reinstate us in the city is to get these names back where they belong as well. If you walk down George Street, you'll see a map with the old names as well. If you just got to look carefully at some of those places. Yeah, so that's slow. But obviously, you know, these names just disappeared because they were built over, really. The first kind of design build that we had to work on, and there's a few people that were involved in this here, was Te Rangi Hiroa, the hostel, and that was a challenge. One, because we had to work with Ngāti Mutunga, because Te Rangi Hiroa's Ngāti Mutunga died with 5 doctorates, comes from the Taranaki area, was the first Māori graduate from Otago University. The university were really keen to call the building Te Rangi Hiroa, and as soon as you do that, it embodies him. It becomes the tupuna Te Rangi Hiroa. So it was an interesting, we had to worked with Ngāti Mutunga and us. I guess we saw ourselves as the whenua, the kaitahu whenua, and then Ngāti Mutunga build on top of that, and so the relationships, you know, really together, and it's close. We worked on the kōrero of the Taranaki prisoners. Our Alison whānau worked tightly, and we had a values framework, and we had a lot of online meetings with Ngāti Mutunga, iwi and us to go through whakapapa and how it is we wanted the build to look. We had a hard time one time. Well, we had to, there's a few people that were here that helped us reconfigure what was, because what happens, I guess, is you get this building and you want to build it, and what we discovered was that sometimes you get architects that they probably want to win a prize for architecture, right? Because often that's the way. And they come in with their own ideas. So there's a tension, right? Because you do want them to have some creative license. But you're going to call it Te Rangi Hiroa, and you're going to, you know, like basically embed the history into that building. It's got to have our whakapapa in there. So we did have to take Ngāti Mutunga and the architects out to the marae and have a hearty discussion. We'll say, I'll just leave it there. If you want to know more, you can ask Royden and Edward. And it was actually a really amazing point in time for us, and I'll never forget it, because it was a hearty discussion. It was hard from both angles, and there were apologies and there was tension, but for me it was like, okay, so this is interesting. So when we do builds, we have to be in there from the get-go. From the very start, before even a pen goes to paper, we have to be in there and know exactly how it is we want it to kind of look. So that was our first kind of mana whenua design piece, really. I'm just going to share a few now. I'm just going to indulge in like how great these things are now. The other ones that we're involved in, and Te Puna, Whakaihu is the name of the river that runs sort of at the back of this actual pool. So we get a chance to embed that name, right? And Te Puna means, Puna is a pool. And so obviously we get to talk about mata, which is this lizard, taniwha, kaitiaki of ours, because it's looking right down onto the Mosgiel pool. And so we get together as a panel of mana whenua across all marae, all local marae. We've got Moeraki, Puketeraki, or Tākau. If I missed anyone else, I think that's pretty much us, and we've got representatives there, and we go through a values framework. Tahu, my husband, created the values framework, and at the core of the values framework are 3 core values that we have embedded in everything we've done in Dunedin in the last 5-6 years. They are mana, tapu, whakapapa and mauri, and we don't really, sometimes one of those values doesn't fit with the design, but mostly those 4 do. And then there are values around the outside, so we spend a lot of time going through that values framework, and it belongs to us, and we roll with it, and it's been tested in a number of areas, and it works for us. And then that goes to writing the narrative, and the narrative goes back and forward to make sure that it's on point and it's correct, etc. So that's embedded in these designs. So here we then get an artist who happens to be Kaitahu. In fact, Ephraim Russell created the waka in the clock tower, and he's done quite a bit of work with us, and so he did all of the art with this particular pool, and so we get to embed the mata kōrero into that pool. And it was loud on Facebook. Dunedin Facebook site was loud, you know, let's be honest. I don't really get on that site very often, but you know, I'm always just really positive that actually it's going to be fine. And even if it's just called Puna, or even if it is called Mosgiel Pool by the Mosgiel people, fine. But they've actually got an embodiment of mata there, and the kōrero of mata, and that's actually what's really important, right? And that our tamariki, Pākehā mai, Māori mai are seeing that. Oops, ACC build, doesn't that look good? I reckon, yeah, we haven't opened it yet, but it's pretty exciting. It's looking amazing, and I know it doesn't quite fit in with the historic builds around it. There was some tension there, but we've gone with it. Like, how did we get here? Pretty cool story. So you'll see that map there, or no, you'll see that black and white picture there, and that is Oti-Puti. So Oti-Puti is a corner point, and you'll see the corner where the harbour comes up, juts up into the corner. So it doesn't look like that now. There's roads built on it. This is pretty much where the ACC build is right now. So I was like, of course it has to be about Oti-Puti. So Oti-Puti's become the name for Dunedin, just like Otago's become the name for Otago, which is from Otako. These things happen. But it's actually just that corner point there. Puti is a 4-cornered basket for containing cooked food. And it's woven differently to any other basket, according to Roka Cameron, who's a master weaver. It's woven from the top down, and quite different weave. I'm not a weaver. I'd rather stick pins in my eyes and weave. It's not my thing. But she knows her stuff. So we don't call them puti anymore. We call them like kete, and they look a certain way, right? This picture is from Te Rangi Hiro's book, Coming of the Māori. So he talked about it in there. This is our framework, and you can see we've got our main values in the middle, and there's other values around the outside. So what we did was we embedded the weave of the kete into the facade of the building. So if you look at the gold, and if you go up to it, you'll see the weave of the actual kete into that entire building. So, and it's going to be called Oti-Puti. So now you'll know that that's what it is. It's quite a simple kōrero. It's not that deep, but it was important for us to be able to do that and acknowledge where it actually sits. Because when we do a cultural narrative on a particular area, we look at the area and the flora and fauna that was there, who was living there, what its history is of the area. So that's pretty exciting. Yeah, what's in a name? I've said this. A name is controversial. So we're naming buildings. There's mana, there's history, a way to connect to the wider community, a message, there's naming rights, and memory. This is Hori Kirei Tairo, by the way. There's going to be an exhibition on him that comes out in the art gallery in August, so you'll get to connect with him on a really, actually his Lindau painting. He is arriving actually tomorrow at the art gallery, which is really exciting. So, so there's going to be an amazing art exhibition on him because we want to reinstate him back. We want to reintroduce him to Dunedin, where he's from. He was born at Otako, he's from Otako. So I just want to share that with you. Name. So he wrote a kōrero. This is his writing, and I've just written it out in Māori again, as it is, because it's quite hard to read. He built a house at Otako. It was his own house, and we name houses. So Māori name houses. It's a thing for us. We name houses after battles. We name them after particular moments so that we don't forget. We name our children like that. So Dad's grandfather was Te Iwi Here Here, the jailing of the people, because at that point that was what was happening for Taranaki people. So that's just what we do. Sometimes they're quite hefty names, right? They're not just tupuna names, but they're named after events. So that's what we do. I just want to, oh no, I won't go back. So he named his house, and it really sort of meant reprisal. Whakatiputupu's about succession. So it means succession and about actually meeting the obligations that his dad left him, his ohaki. His dad left him this ohaki, or this these last words to say, look son, I stuffed up really, to be honest. We signed a deed. We signed the treaty thinking that we were signing honourably with the Queen, and the promises have been broken. So now it's your job to fix that. You know, he didn't quite say it like that, but you know. And so basically HK dedicated his entire life to working on this, and that's why he became an MP in Parliament, etc. The rest is history. He dedicated his entire life to the claim, basically. So also he wrote copious amounts, like I said, and these are lists, mahinga kai lists, or food gatherer. They were lists of place names and where we gathered food, and they were sort of the backbone of a big part of the Ngāi claim. And so in there he talks about Te Awa o Tāko. Our old people called it a river, and you can see here that it does look like a river. The bush in the area would have been just dripping into the harbour, and it would have probably looked a bit more like a fjord, and apparently the birdsong was deafening, so it would have been quite different to what it is now. And so it did probably feel like a river, to be honest, and so that's what it's called. But in here he writes about all the various fish, and some of those are extinct now, and shellfish, etc. So these are the things that we're putting into, and maps. We've got maps as well that we're reinstating into the city and into design. In George Street, we've got some of his quotes, not this one, this is a beauty, but I'd like to get this one in here somewhere. It's in English, and he talks about, obviously the piece that's interesting, he who speaks falsely to another ought to feel the flames of hell. So this was one of his speeches in Parliament, and they're really ferocious, a lot of them, really beautiful English. And someone suggested that his wife probably helped him pen some of these speeches, but maybe she did, I don't know. And so some of his kōrero is being, you'll see it actually in George Street, some of this kōrero in the concrete. So trying to get these words of his and other tupuna, there's other tupuna in George Street as well, into the concrete basically, so that it's there forever. I'm going to go a bit further ahead actually. George Street. So also part of this is actually there are other tupuna that are fully involved in George Street. This guy here was a Ngāi chief, Pōtiki, and 106 other Māori petitioned the Otago Provincial Superintendent William Cargill to build a place of shelter for their use on the Dunedin foreshore. So there were many other tupuna involved, not just HK, and he was a part of that group. So getting those what eventually we would love to see is actually seeing those tupuna in the street. So you've got our poet in the octagon, but actually seeing those tupuna in the places that they had an impact on. And eventually, I would personally love to see HK in Princess Street, in the reserve that he fought for, because he fought for an area that in fact we fought for up until the 1970s. We were fighting for an area that was protected, we had thought, for us, but it was built on in the end, and that is kind of where the old post office is down in the Exchange, and so getting him and his story reinstated in that area is actually really critical, I think, because the problem is that Dunediners, they don't actually understand that. And I think, there's nothing wrong with bringing that history to the fore. There's little pockets of it. There's a little kōrero about Toitu, and there's Toitu Museum, but do you really understand what that means? Probably not. So it needs to be more explicit. And we know that obviously, like here it says last petition to Parliament was 1979. We know that Māori in the city, at the point of contact, we were trading, but then they wanted us out of the city. They evicted us basically, and so you might wonder why Otako is a village out on the edge of the peninsula. No, we weren't actually a village out on the edge of the peninsula. It might look like that now because there's a marae out there and that's where we live, but actually we were entirely through a lot of the, well, right through in fact to the Sounds, Milford Sounds. Our area goes all the way through there, and we had villages everywhere. There were villages on the other side of the harbour. We had many on the peninsula, many in town. In the Taiari area, which was like our supermarket, because momona means fat, the fat of the land, so we were everywhere. So don't assume that we were a little kike out on the edge of the peninsula, because we weren't, but we were evicted basically from being in our rohe. So all of those stories are important to embed in our design. Which is what we've got, right? So you'll see that this is some of the mapping that went into George Street, and if you look down as you're walking in George Street, you'll see the maps, and so we've got those kōrero in there. You'll see little things like hooks made of supplejack on the edge of the seats, which is actually DCC, they're not quite big enough. It's a little bit subtle, just going to say that, but they're really, and actually really cool images on poles of whaling stations, so it talks about that colonisation piece as well. So there's lots in George Street, and you just need to go looking for it and you'll see it. There's this kōrero in George Street, which is about let the salt water and the fresh water be mixed, and that's talking about Pākehā Māori coming together in a good way, in a positive way, and that's down opposite Farmers. You'll see that kōrero, which comes from another tupuna of 1860, Mereke Hereke Hape, tōna ingoa. Ōwhio, it's a river. It isn't a place that had anything weird going on in it. I've read that in a few places, that it was some tapu river that had pure sort of rituals going on. No, none of that. That's not correct. It was a river, probably had ducks and inanga and eels and all sorts in it. It was a mahinga kai river, and we know that. And there's a village at the mouth of the river, so it had to be related to food, right? And it runs right out to the harbour. So that runs through your guys' university. And so we embedded that in the food science building, is that what it's called? And we've named it Te Rai o Te Hinaki. Hinaki is you can see a hinaki there, it catches eels. And so related to tuna. So we've embedded the kōrero of Ōwhio into that build. I think that's yet to be opened, is that right? I'm not too sure where that's at, but yes. So that is another opportunity for us to do that. The kōrero from Ōwhio has been a little bit corrupted and changed, strangely. So it's an opportunity for us to just get that right, get that back on track, because it's nothing weird. It is literally a simple river that had kai in it. This is the science area in the university. Sorry if I've got that wrong. They came to us once again, mana whenua, and asked for a narrative. And we didn't go too deep on this one, but it was like, wow, what's the science of making piu-piu? It's pretty intense. I don't know, as I said, I'm not a weaver, but we took the piu-piu kōrero, and because it's really complicated, because you have to get the harakeke, you have to dry it, you have to get a particular type of mud that takes to the harakeke, which in fact we haven't been able to find anywhere in Dunedin, but what probably did exist, but it's probably been affected over time, and so embedded that entire kōrero into this build, which is actually really beautiful if you've ever been in there. It's really lovely. The other area that we worked on was Tunnel Beach, and you'd probably think like, oh, Tunnel Beach, Māoris must have been hanging out there. No, probably not, because even though it's really cool, it's amazing, Tunnel Beach, this is one where there wasn't a lot of history directly there. And so we had to draw on an old map. So there's an old map. If you go for a walk at Tunnel Beach, you'll see an old map on the ground there. So we drew on a map that goes down the coast, all the way down the coast to Toko Mairero, as far as that, and pulled in all the old place names. In fact, there's some titi, there's titi there close by, so we drew on that and some of the kōrero of the ocean, but actually sometimes it's really hard to find direct kōrero when we just weren't necessarily there. And here we have, I'm getting to the end now, getting there. Just make sure I'm all right, on track. Yep. And I guess one of the other things that, I mean, this is actually probably could be updated because there's a few more, but these in orange are actually some of the places that we've worked on. So there's the tāwhaki po at the university. So tāwhaki is our kōrero about knowledge, not a knowledge holder. So it's different to some other iwi. Some other iwi have a different kōrero, but ours is very much about tāwhaki. So that was an easy no-brainer to come up with a narrative there. Te Rangihiroa, the museum we did do a narrative for the museum. I'm not sure where that is, and it's called Tuhura. The hospital obviously comes with its baggage at the moment, political baggage, but we actually were fully involved in the design for the hospital, and it was interesting for us. The biggest, most important value for the hospital was tapu, because it's a restricted place when Māori believe when you're sick or when you're dying that you're tapu, and the area or the place that you sit in or you rest in is tapu. And in fact, in some places up north, they would then burn that building. If that person passed away, it's tapu, and then they burn the building. So we were working with tapu in the hospital. We worked deeply on that kōrero. And one of the things that sort of drove me when I was talking to the architects who were really great, when my husband was dying in the Auckland hospital, which is quite a warren to kind of like work your way out, to get out of the hospital, my son was like always worried about how his spirit was going to get home. So, and every time we'd leave, there'd be tears, and how's his wairua going to get out of the hospital? Because I can't see it, can't see how it's going to get out. Because what happens is we believe when we die, our spirit leaves our body and it goes on a journey to a leaping spot. Not necessarily te rerenga wairua. We have ours at Otako called te akatapu. It looks like a ramp, a skate ramp, and it goes up really high and then it just jumps. It's sort of like as a steep cliff to the bottom into water. And so we believe that body then, the spirit goes to the leaping spot, it dives into the waters of Tāne, and it goes to a house, I suppose for want of a better word, underworld in the water, where the woman of the night, Hine Nui Te Pō, is. And for us in Kaitahu, her two daughters, Tahu Kumea and Tahu Whakairo, are the po of the door to that whare, and you are beckoned in and to be with your ancestors who are in that whare. So that's our journey, and I believe it. I'll be gutted if that doesn't happen, but I believe that, and so what the architects did was like they pivoted the mortuary and the hospital to Te Akatapu on the peninsula. So it actually connects up in a line, so those spirits can leave the hospital. So it's quite Māori in a sense. They have embedded kawa leaves, which are related to the dead, obviously, into the hospital design. There's water where people can wash and cleanse. So we've embedded a lot of tikanga into the hospital. I don't know how it's going to all land. Obviously, that's another issue. But the architects were really amazing, actually, in the space, and they really listened to us. So sometimes the tension with architects it's not always great, right? Sometimes it's really hard to work with Māori architects because they have their narrative that they want to place on your narrative, and perhaps they think they know better. But actually we've had to fight pretty hard in the space in the last 6 years in Dunedin and say, actually no, we know our narrative and we know what we need to do here. So the hospital's an interesting one called Whakatiputupu. We've got George Street, the ACC build, South Dunedin Library, been involved in that, and Kiwi Rail, Mosgiel Pool, and there's others to come. So we are infiltrating the city with reinstating our mana, right, back into it. And it might be subtle in some places, but it's actually I'll be able to be with my tahu and know that actually I think at least my kids can see themselves in the city, right, in places that they couldn't before, and that's what's really important. And lastly, just a mihi to Tipina Regan, actually, who was at the helm of, he actually did this lecture, who was at the helm of getting us across the line. The Ngāti claim kind of brought us together. But just a little story, this is my son and this is my husband when he was 20, 21 maybe, and there's my sons and my husband there. And Timothy was obviously bereaved after his dad died, because he was a great dad, and he was like, I need to write to Tipini, because Tipini was a mentor for my husband. And so he wrote this email to him. And in the email, he's like, how can I be useful to Ngaitahu? I think he's probably 11 at this stage. I want to be useful, I want to be a leader, I want to be useful to Ngaitahu. But beautifully, Tipini wrote back this handwritten letter, and it's like, you could frame it, and I've kept it, it's very special. And he gave him like 9 points on how to be a leader. One being, take people with you. Don't think you're better than anyone else. Do the hard work. And his last point was, be good to your mother. It's all of these things that sort of drive me, really, because I just think, well, he's just he's taken the time, to do that for my son, and my son can rattle off those 9 points, and he uses them at school. And I think, that's the most important thing, is like, what's your legacy? It's actually probably taking people with you. Māori mai, Pākehā mai on this journey that we're in. And it's a privilege, right? It's an absolute privilege. So that was a real round robin, all over the place talk. But you might have some questions, you may not later, but we're going to have some kai. And I think probably if you've got questions, there's other people you can ask in the room too, because there's certainly people here that know a lot more than me, and have a lot more stories to share. So I just thank you for taking the time. I know it's wet and horrible out there, and when I looked at that tour, I was like, oh, here we go. This is a sign. This is not meant to happen. And so, because I pulled this together in October last year. So I appreciate it. So thank you. Kia ora. How to turn this off.
My goodness me, I feel dazzled, enriched. I've learnt a huge amount. I won't look at Dunedin through the same eyes. I feel like you've lifted veils, and I've got new appreciation for all sorts of things. I just saw the ACC building the other day, and I almost fell over backwards. I hadn't been down there for 2 years, and now I know why. But just fantastic. So very rich, very detailed lecture. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We knew it would be quite lengthy, and we do have a wonderful spread of kai waiting for everybody upstairs. I loved your expression, hearty discussions, and I hope that that's what we will have together in a few minutes. But would you please join me in thanking Megan for a wonderful lecture. And we'd already bought the flowers last October, which we gave to her anyway. And she really didn't want anything this time, but we couldn't let you give that lecture without a very small token of appreciation from the whole history programme. So that's for you and your kids. And thank you very much again. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And please do come upstairs. There's lots of food for us. Thank you.